Hi there, my name is Liam. It is currently August 25th, 2023. It is 6:47 p.m. and I'm currently drinking a Blake's Hard Cider Strawberry Zen. And today, we're going to talk about the latest entry in the long-running RPG franchise Final Fantasy XVI. So, to give a little personal background before we start off, Final Fantasy is my favorite game franchise of all time. I have played every mainline number title, with the exception of 11, which I have not played even 1 second of, and 14, which I've played about 20 to maybe 30 hours of, but not so much that I can really give a fleshed out opinion. I was hugely anticipating the release of Final Fantasy XVI. To say that I was hyped is a bit of an understatement. I was calling it my RPG of the generation. I was telling everyone with a PS5 that they needed to get this game. I was considering it my game of the year before I even had it in my hands. I was very excited for this game. I was this game's target demographic. I was the person who was ready to sing the praises of Final Fantasy XVI to every single person. And after having played it and letting it stew in my mind for a bit, I think that's what compelled me to make this video. It left me feeling very conflicted. I had so many positive things to say and so many negative things to say, and the only way I was able to really get it all out was, of course, to write all my thoughts down, which is exactly what I did. Now I'm going to share those thoughts with you in the form of a long-form analysis, whatever the fuck you want to call it. So I'm going to start with a quick summary, and then we'll go breaking down each of the main... Well, I'm going to break the game down into gameplay, story, and presentation, and I'll break each of those categories down into more granular, specific categories, and just basically make it so I can cover every single thing that I want to cover. And so let's just jump into it, no more preamble. My final playtime at the end of my first playthrough was 74 hours, and I had 90% completion. Final Fantasy XVI is a good game that doesn't reach its full potential. The core mechanics are very polished with a great feel to them, and the presentation is absolutely top-notch. The main scenario had a ton of phenomenal moments that hit me just right, whether it was making me laugh, cry, or shout at my TV in pure joy at the hype of it all. There is a lot of good character writing and character interactions that are great to see in an RPG, and the music is absolutely out of this world, easily one of my favorite Final Fantasy soundtracks, which is obviously saying something. Unfortunately, it falls short of greatness by having a fair amount of issues that bring down the core experience. These issues are prevalent enough to where I'll say that, as much as I was really looking forward to and really primed to love Final Fantasy XVI, taking a step back from it all and letting it stew in my mind for a bit, I can't help but feel disappointed. Final Fantasy XVI's greatest trick is that the highs are so amazingly high that they do make you forget about the fact that a lot of what this game actually has you doing is pretty boring and tedious and uninspired. On top of that, the story has a lot of great moments, both cinematic and emotional, but as it goes on, the structure starts to fall apart, and the themes conflict with what's actually happening on screen. The main villain is just not interesting or memorable at all, and some of the best characters are underutilized, while some of the most one-dimensional characters get huge roles in the story. The gameplay is very enjoyable for what it is, but it feels like it sacrifices depth for the sake of polish, which is doubly disappointing when you consider the fact that, this game was marketed as having, the action game Avengers working on it. There are several core features of the franchise that are either missing or are present in diluted form, and the difficulty is just way too easy for its own good. When Final Fantasy XVI is firing on all cylinders, it is a truly incredible experience. Unforgettable. But when it's not, which is often, it dips down into mediocrity beyond what I think is acceptable for a mainline FF title. So with that out of the way, I'm going to get into my in-depth thoughts on the game. I'm going to break down, like I said, gameplay, story, and presentation, and get even more granular after that. So let's just start right away with gameplay and combat. The combat in Final Fantasy XVI is very solid on the whole. It has an extremely kinetic and high-octane feeling that I haven't gotten in a game in a very long time. Everything functions as it should and the controls are tight and responsive. When a fight goes well and you're landing consecutive abilities and countering and reacting to what the enemy is doing, it feels very good. You have a lot of different abilities to play around with, and the game is very much designed around giving the player the option to approach combat in any way they want. Being able to create your own custom loadouts with a total of 9 abilities available for use gives players plenty of different combinations to experiment with. In general, the combat has a very solid game feel to it. The dodging and the blocking feel great, the parrying is consistent, all the abilities have the proper weight and speed to them, and the feedback on the controller makes it feel that much more visceral. Not to mention the combos you can pull off in this game are pretty damn impressive if you know what you're doing. Much has been said about the lack of traditional RPG elements in FF16. I see this as both a positive and a negative. Positive because it gives you freedom to create a viable loadout based on your personal taste and not what the game requires. You'll never have to restart a fight in FF16 because you don't have the correct abilities equipped to take advantage of enemy weaknesses. The downside to this one-size-fits-all approach is something that does lessen the depth, for lack of a better word, of the combat system. This approach to combat is something that, generally speaking, FF has avoided up to this point because RPGs are usually at their best when more strategic elements are in play, be they turn-based, MMO style, or action RPGs. The lack of these traditional elements ultimately does eliminate the need to really think about what you're doing. So long as you have the reactions to dodge attacks, and let's be real, the dodge window is very generous, you'll never be at threat of dying. Whatever way you choose to attack an enemy will always be viable, as this game has no weakness or resistance system. Now, that's not to say that there's no difference in how an unskilled player versus an average player versus a skilled player will do when it comes to speed and efficiency of taking down enemies and bosses. The difference is pretty clear. If you know what you're doing, you can melt bad guys pretty quickly, and it feels very satisfying to do so. I don't want to extol the virtues of elemental weaknesses as if they are something only true Mensa members can figure out and use. You don't have to be clever to figure out weaknesses and exploit them, especially considering many FF games allow you to use abilities like Scan or Assess that just tell you the weaknesses outright. But that's fine, because exploiting weaknesses isn't really about being clever, it's about feeling clever. This is, of course, not just an FF thing. Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, Tales of, Dragon Quest, Kingdom Hearts, Pokemon, Trails, etc. all use these types of mechanics to some degree. Some might consider the reliance on these kinds of systems a weakness in and of themselves because they effectively pigeonhole you into playing battles a certain way. Find weakness, exploit weakness, repeat until victory. There is certainly some truth to this. For example, when playing SMT or Persona games, you're pretty much always going to want to be exploiting weaknesses because of how the press turn system works. The advantages are very clear. Pokemon, which, yes, I know, is a game explicitly targeted at children, has not abandoned the type advantage mechanic for its entire existence. Everyone going into a Pokemon game knows that when you get to the water gym, you'll want to have either grass or electric types on hand to deal with those battles. I would argue that while it's true there is technically more choice in your approach compared to what you can do in FF16, it's just as mindless at the end of the day because, in truth, the choice has already been made for you. Unless you're explicitly trying to make the game harder for yourself, or you're not trying to essentially, play the correct way, 99% of people are going to make what amounts to the same choice. Pick a Pokemon that can exploit the type advantage. I find the best implementation of these kinds of systems to be the ones that incorporate a series of small decisions that reward savvy players, rather than making it feel like the bare minimum required to effectively play the game. Kingdom Hearts 1 is a great example of this with its tech point system. You by no means have to use Blizzard to defeat fire enemies or fire to defeat ice enemies. Whacking them with your Keyblade will always be a perfectly viable option. But using magic to exploit those weaknesses and bring them down faster grants you bonus experience, which incentivizes you to think just that much more about what you're doing, even if it's a very small decision. I think something akin to tech points would have greatly benefited FF16. Perhaps not with elements, but with swordplay. Considering that Clive can parry from the start of the game, it would have been great to be granted bonus XP or bonus damage for a short period of time after a successful parry. Perhaps precision dodges that are immediately followed up by a successful counterattack could either deal bonus damage or grant bonus XP. Perhaps a successful use of Rook's Gambit or Raging Fist could also grant some kind of permanent or temporary bonus. Using lightning abilities on flying enemies, or fire abilities on plant enemies, or ice abilities on bombs, and so on. They don't necessarily need to be made weak to certain elements, but rather the bonuses could be applied to Clive himself. there are ways of implementing these kinds of systems that don't just rely on use X ability on Y enemy to deal bonus damage. Something I never see brought up about 16 and is unforgivable as far as I'm concerned is that the game just straight up lies to you about its magic system. When Clive gets a new icon, the game tells you explicitly that the quote, elemental aspect of your magic has changed. When they say this, they are referring to your triangle ability that shoots magic on the default control setup. The wording here implies that there is a meaningful distinction between the magic you shoot when you have different icons equipped, but this is just blatantly not true. All that's actually changed is how it looks, nothing else. I refuse to believe that this is like a translation oversight, so I'm really not sure why it's worded this way. In a game where the main crux of the protagonist's progression comes from acquiring various elemental abilities, it's a shame that these are nothing more than an aesthetic quality. It definitely feels like wasted potential, and it feels a little bit alienating for longtime fans because this kind of thing is expected. I don't want to imply that elemental weaknesses were a huge factor in the previous games. You know, for the most part, you could get along fine without exploiting them, especially when many of them became obsolete by the late game due to stronger non-elemental magic like Flare and Meteor and Ultima. But even if they weren't required for victory, they were still present, and I'll always appreciate their inclusion because it adds just that little bit more depth for those that are looking for it. The fact that all your magic shots are totally identical except for how they look is something that kind of just blows my mind. Again, putting aside any elemental stuff, there should have been a greater emphasis on differentiating these, if only for variety's sake. Imagine if every icon also had a unique form of ranged magic along with their iconic ability. Here are a few ideas that could have gone a long way towards creating that variety. Fire could be the same as it is now, a fast-moving fireball where maybe the charge attack leaves a burn status. Wind could have been a tornado that isn't a straight shot, but rather it curves and knocks enemies up, allowing for an instant follow-up. Thunder could have been a short-range AoE that's something like a shotgun, or a continuous chain of lightning like something you would see from a Sith Lord in Star Wars. Earth could have been a kind of rock formation that travels along the ground like something you'd see from an Earthbender or an Avatar. Ice could have been a thing where you queue up a bunch of icicles and then release them all at once, and so on. You know, there are ways of creating more variety beyond just different colored balls that you shoot at the enemy. Something else that is lacking in 16's combat outside of the elemental stuff is a general expansion on your basic moveset. The fact that Clive only gets this 4-hit combo that never gets upgraded or has any meaningful modifiers throughout the whole game, again, feels like wasted potential. Something like DMC pause combos or a Kingdom Hearts Combo Plus ability would have felt very welcome here. Clive's basic moveset is fine as it is, but these small inclusions would go a long way towards making your basic swordplay just that much more engaging. The stagger system makes another appearance in FF16, as it seems to just be a requirement for most modern FF games at this point. I don't have much to say about the stagger in FF16. It's probably one of the most simple implementations of a stagger in any game that I've seen it in. You can play around it if you want to, but you really don't have to, because as long as you continue to do damage, the stagger will eventually be triggered, at which point you are free to continue doing what you were already doing. I have seen some commentary claiming that the game is designed around the player holding onto all their cooldowns, so that when the stagger triggers, you're supposed to just unload them all at once for maximum damage. This is puzzling to me, considering that there are several abilities explicitly designed for building up stagger as opposed to doing damage, so this seems like a weird complaint. You do not have to hoard your ability cooldowns for the sake of unloading them all during the stagger phase, because basically every ability that isn't the giant AoE at the bottom of each icon's skill tree is on a low enough cooldown to where you will comfortably have several of them up by the time the stagger hits. We also have Torgal. I love Torgal, but there's not much to say about him. You use the D-pad to make him do either an attack, a shitty heal, or a different attack. Sometimes he's useful for juggling. That covers everything related to Torgal. Lastly, we'll briefly talk about the combat as Ifrit. Frankly, I don't have much to say about this either because it occurs only a handful of times, but I loved each one of them. Even the Garuda fight, which is easily the weakest of the bunch. Your basic moveset is a simplified version of what you can do in human form, so it's an easy transition. And the spectacle of it all was truly something to behold, just really stellar all around. My only real complaint would be that I do tend to agree that the fights can sometimes drag on just a tad too long. I think if everything else was left the same and your basic attacks did like 20 to 25% more damage, that would be ideal. As much as I do genuinely enjoy the combat mechanics on offer in FF16, I do think there's still a lot of unrealized potential here that could have turned something that's already pretty good into something truly great and timeless, but unfortunately, that's not what we got. Now we're going to talk about character progression. To quote or paraphrase Chris Wolfhart of the Gigaboots Podcast Network, the core appeal of an RPG as a video game experience is the enjoyment that comes from getting strong. Putting aside everything else about RPGs, most players want to feel like once they reach the final boss, they've gone through a profound transformation as a result of all their hard work. This is fundamental to the DNA of an RPG, so how does FF16 do in this regard? Well, the answer is, it's fine, but it's also kind of weird. For every battle and quest you complete, you gain experience and ability points. Nothing crazy. When you gain enough XP, you gain a level up to a max of 50 on the base difficulty and 100 on the Final Fantasy difficulty. The level ups in FF16 seem to be standardized throughout the whole game. As far as I could tell, you always gain an extra 50 hit points to your max health upon leveling up, and like 2 to 3 points in every other stat, which is not a lot at all. It doesn't hurt the game per se in the sense that it makes it actively worse, but it doesn't make leveling up a very compelling goal either, because it's just the same every time and you're not getting that much out of it. As for ability points, I think these were handled much better. As you progress, you'll be getting the powers of various icons, and with those icons come 5 unique abilities. 3 of those abilities are available as soon as you get the icon, and the other 2 have to be unlocked by spending AP. Every ability can be upgraded once to make it stronger and grant a bonus effect, and then one more time to master it, which allows you to assign that ability to any of your icon loadouts. I'm very happy to see something like this in the game, because it would have been way too restrictive otherwise, and creating custom loadouts to see how abilities mesh together was some of the most fun that I had with the game. Ability points are also completely refundable at any time, so you're never at risk of feeling like you wasted them on something you don't like, which I can't stress enough was absolutely the correct decision. By the end of the game, you do feel pretty badass, and certainly like you've been on a journey. Going to the endgame fights, weaving your abilities one after the other along with the various techs that you've probably mastered by this point was quite satisfying. Especially when you get Zantetsuken, at that point you really do feel like a god. Unfortunately though, it would have felt much better if the things I just mentioned in my combat portion of the video were present, but FF16 does understand the assignment to some degree. Boss fights. The boss fights in FF16 are easily counted among the game's greatest strengths. For many players, they are undoubtedly going to be the highlight of the whole experience. I loved pretty much every single boss fight in this game. The only ones that I can think of that I didn't care for were in the Iron Kingdom, where 2 of the fights are just repeat encounters from earlier in the game, and Liquid Flame, which I just found to be kind of annoying. Otherwise, the game has produced some of the best boss fights in the action RPG genre in a very long time. The fights with the other dominants and their icons were truly fantastic, with a great sense of flow to them and absolutely stunning cutscene choreography. The final boss as well is deserving of immense praise. When Clive was matching Ultima icon for icon with the voices of the allies shouting in the background, I was screaming, "Yeah!" at my TV. It was just so cool. FF16 does include QuickTime events in its boss fights in the form of cinematic strikes, evasions, and clashes. I don't have an issue with these as inclusions, but I do wish the timing for them was just much shorter, because if you're paying attention, it shouldn't take you more than a second or 2 to press a single button. If it's going to be this mechanically simple, then the trade-off should have been that it goes pretty fast. It's a nice touch, though, that on the Final Fantasy difficulty, the button prompts are removed, so you do have to pay more attention to what's happening on screen, or at least the color. Difficulty. Oh boy. This all pertains to the game's action-focused difficulty that can be chosen at the start of a fresh file. So in other words, it basically just means not using the timely accessories. One of the biggest weaknesses of FF16's gameplay is its difficulty, or rather its lack thereof. This game is just way too easy. When it really comes down to it, it's that your defensive options are way too strong. I said it earlier, but it bears repeating that the timing window for the precision dodge, as well as the cinematic strikes and evasions, is just way too generous. It's not out of bounds to say that you can kind of just spam R1 and get through most of these fights relatively unscathed. That's on top of the fact that the timely accessories literally automate evasion, or make it the same as a cinematic evasion but on a small level, where you just press the button, time slows down, and then you press the button to get out of the way. I watched a lot of people stream FF16, people at all different kinds of skill levels and familiarity with action games. Not once did I see anyone using the timely accessories, because there's just no need to. These accessibility features were marketed as something to help those unfamiliar with action games, but in reality, it feels like it's for those unfamiliar with games in general. The blocking ability granted by Titan can be used to negate any hit as far as I'm aware, and while the timing on that feels slightly less generous than dodging, it's still not very difficult. Yeah, it feels great to pull it off, but it would have felt even greater if it was like an actual clutch and life-saving thing, and not something you mostly just do to style on the enemy. Enemies themselves are not aggressive enough. Basic encounters in the overworld will usually die without landing a single blow on you because if you just play even moderately aggressive in this game, you'll just wipe everything. The larger enemies and with the stagger bars can sometimes get the better of you for a moment, but it won't take you very long to figure out what they're cooking and dispatch them. The only times that I died or got close to dying was during the hunts, where I would go out of my way to fight higher level monsters who usually had movesets I was unfamiliar with. On top of all that, the damage that you take when you actually do get hit is not particularly high, and it's easily negated through the use of items which instantly activate. There's no animation, which you'll have a lot of by the end of the game. When you die in a boss fight, you get checkpointed at the most recent cinematic part of that fight, so the most recent cinematic strike or evasion or clash or whatever, which usually means the boss is at half health or less, and your entire item stock is refilled to full, which is very strange to me. I guess they just didn't want you to get stuck in a loop or something, but I get it. I really do get it. This was the first mainline numbered title to be a true action game in a franchise that up to this point had been turn-based, or if not entirely turn-based, then still command-based. No, I am not counting Final Fantasy XV. Sorry to any 15 heads out there if you exist, but that's not a completed game, so I'm not including it. Final Fantasy has never been a franchise for its difficulty, so it's not really a break in tradition that the new entry is kind of a breeze. I understand the desire to play it safe, especially when it's supposed to have as wide appeal to the mass market as possible, but I also think this is just a misread on Square's part of the current, gaming landscape. If the success of From Software's output over the last 10 years tells us anything, it's that difficulty in games is not a death sentence anymore when it comes to sales. I'm not saying FF needs to become Dark Souls, but if you're going to take it in a new direction, then you need to commit to that more than they have here. The games that FF16 is being compared to, by and large, are more difficult and demand greater execution on the part of players. That's kind of the point of action games. The Final Fantasy difficulty that becomes available on New Game Plus should have just been the default difficulty. I would love to see how this feels when you don't have a fully expanded item inventory and access to every icon. Now we're going to talk about game progression. The progression through the main narrative of FF16 feels very bipolar. It basically just swaps back and forth between two different modes. The first mode is linear action stage mode, where you move forward, killing bad guys, fight a boss or a mini-boss, kill more bad guys, and then end by beating the main boss of that area. The second mode is traversal through the segmented open areas that connect the world of Valistia. Here you fight bad guys, do a little bit of exploration, visit towns and talk to NPCs, sometimes doing side quests along the way before you move on to the next area and repeat it all. Playing the game when it's in linear action mode is great. It feels like this is how it was meant to be played, and it's where all the coolest stuff happens. Playing the game in Valistia mode isn't actively painful or anything, but it's just totally uninspired. It feels like playing a Tales of game, which hasn't abandoned this design philosophy for the past 10 years or so. I got bored of it there, so putting it in Final Fantasy isn't going to make me like it anymore. To make matters worse, much of the quest design in the main narrative is unforgivably tedious. There's absolutely no one who wants to spend their time walking around towns talking to nameless NPCs about what to do next. This is bad side quest content that is gating my ability to see interesting main quest content. It's also not great world building because none of it feels natural. I'm being totally serious when I say all this type of content should have just been cut entirely and replaced with conversations between the main cast of characters. If people want to go around talking to NPCs to learn more about the world, that's totally fine, but it should not be required. The game really needed some fat trimming. Frankly, I think JRPGs in general should be moving past this kind of, segmented world design, so it's extra disappointing to see it in the most recent FF title. Call me a fanboy, but this is a franchise that should be creating new standards as it has in the past, not impotently propping up outdated design. Between the two game modes, you'll be making frequent trips to the Hideaway where Clive and the gang plan their next move. I like the hideaway for what it is, but there's just not much you can do here besides talking to your buddies, using the forge in the shop, and reading the tomes. I like that all the mementos that Clive gathers throughout the game are displayed in his room. That's a great touch. But that's about the only meaningful change you can make to the hideaway. A base building mechanic or something where you can actually improve the conditions or the look of the hideaway would have been a great inclusion and added to the RPG feel of the game. Okay, now we're going to talk about the side content. The side content in FF16 boils down to three main things: chronolith trials, hunts, and side quests. Two of these things are awesome and I love their inclusion. The other one is so bad that I am baffled it exists in its current form. I am of course talking about the side quests. God, where do I even start? The side quests in FF16 are boring as shit, and there are way too many of them. They are literally just MMO-style side quests in the vein of, go here and collect 3 items, go there and kill these monsters, or in the worst instances, walk around town and talk to a few people. That's it. This kind of thing was bad enough when it was happening in the main scenario, but the fact that all the side quests are designed this way just sucks so bad. If you're someone like me who wants to see everything the game has to offer, these quests are absolute poison for the pacing. Instead of appearing at a reasonable rate, a bunch of them will be unceremoniously dropped on you all at once after a major story event. To add insult to injury, there is a lot of great character writing and world building in a lot of these quests. I really enjoyed that all your main hideaway buddies get all their own stories that wonderfully flesh them out as characters and give them a ton of great moments, as well as many of the side characters you meet in the world. But even the best written quests can't escape the confines of the dogshit quest design. Every quest that requires you to kill some bad guys should have been removed and replaced with a hunt. Every quest that requires you to go talk to people around town should have been removed and replaced with something to do with the main cast of characters. Every quest that has to do with fleshing out the characters, particularly the ones at the hideaway, should have been given a special colored icon so I could instantly know that it's going to feature a character I actually want to spend time with. Otherwise, it's kind of a crapshoot. There probably should have just been like half as many side quests as there are in total. Again, this game seriously needed some fat trimming. On top of all that is the sad reality that the rewards you get for most of these quests are completely meaningless in the grand scheme of it all because items and gear have a greatly diminished role in FF16. Many of these quests would be considered boring filler in an MMO. So it is crazy to me that they are such a prominent element of this game. CBU3, let me put this as simply as I can. Walking around town to read stone tablets and then reciting the contents of those tablets back to an old guy that I have no attachment to is not a good use of my time, no matter how short it actually is. I will say, though, that a lot of the side quests have very funny or clever names, so gotta give them kudos for that, I guess. Thankfully, the hunts and the chronolith trials are much better and are great inclusions to the game overall. In the hideaway, there is a hunt board that the player can check on to get info about various unique enemy encounters all over the world. I had a blast with each of these fights because they gave me the only real challenge that is available in the game, and any chance I had to flex all the new icon powers I was unlocking was very welcome. I also like that there isn't a map marker to indicate where exactly the hunts are. You have to actually find them on your own because you know it's a hunt. The chronolith trials are pocket dimension challenge rooms that are unlocked late into the game. They require the player to go through waves of enemies using only a predetermined set of abilities from a single icon, all while on a time limit that can be extended based on how well you play. I have nothing bad to say about these. I love that they are here. Okay, now we're going to talk about gear, items, and crafting. This is the last part of the gameplay section. To put it bluntly, anything to do with gear and items in FF16 is pretty pathetic. The only items you'll ever need to use are potions and high potions. I barely used any of the tonics that boost your attack or defense or how fast your limit gauge fills up because the game is just so easy that they're just not necessary. The only time I used an elixir was by accident because I was trying to use a Torgal command and was on the wrong menu. The gear in FF16 is better than the items, but that's not saying much. At any given time, you can equip a weapon, 2 pieces of armor, and 3 accessories. When it comes to weapon and armor, it really is just a case of scrolling through the shop or the forge and picking the gear that makes number go up. There are like 4 relevant stats in FF16, so there isn't a whole lot of thought required for any of this. Though I do love all the designs of the swords Clive uses, and I appreciate that each piece of gear has some lore attached to it that can be read up on. As for the accessories, some do give useful bonuses, but the majority of them just buff a single iconic ability by lowering its cooldown somewhere between 2 and 10 seconds, which doesn't feel particularly significant. Rather than having so many accessories tied to single abilities, they should have just consolidated them all into one accessory per icon that buffs all the abilities of that icon across the board. Then it would feel like I'm actually making a meaningful choice when deciding when to use one of my 3 accessory slots. It would also push players more towards enhancing their specific playstyle if they like a specific icon. Personally, I had the accessories that equipped the amount of AP, XP, and gil on through the entire game until the very end when I knew it wouldn't matter because I was about to fight the final boss. The crafting system in this game is kind of mind-boggling to me. Frankly, I'm not sure why it's in the game to begin with, maybe beyond just this kind of thing being expected in an RPG. That's just speculation, to be fair, but that's the impression I got. If you're including a whole system in your game out of a sense of obligation, then I think you're making a huge mistake, because you're placing the vague expectations of what an RPG is supposed to be over any sort of creative vision or what actually works best for your game. Crafting works exactly how you would think it does. You go to the forge, when you have enough of XYZ crafting item, you can make a new weapon or piece of armor or an accessory. The issue is that you are given such an incredible surplus of all the items that you need for crafting that the entire system may as well just not be included in the first place because there's no real grinding aspect to it. And that's kind of the point of a crafting system in an RPG, isn't it? Getting the best gear through use of crafting should require extra effort because you're getting extra rewards. You get so many of these crafting materials just naturally playing the game and doing side quests that it didn't even register in my brain when I was getting them anymore. So being able to actually make new gear kind of felt random. I wasn't even reading the recipes when scrolling through the forge because it's pretty much assured that you'll be able to craft a new piece of gear just through absorbing items as you play the game. The only time I had to go out of my way to acquire a crafting material was when getting the orichalcums, because they are the rarest material needed for the best gear. And in the instance of the orichalcums, they're locked behind hunts and side quests, which I was going to do anyway. If it were up to me, the entire crafting system would be removed outright, and I would make all new weapons and gear either buyable from the shop, rewards for completing main story missions, because that's basically what happens anyway when you get the unique crafting materials from defeating dominants, or as rewards for side quests and hunts, because God knows those needed some actual satisfying rewards for completion. I think people would be way less pissed about this game's side quests if they were actually getting cool swords or armor or accessories by completing them. Okay, that's everything to do with gameplay. Now, we're going to talk about the story. I'm not going to do a full plot summary because if you're watching this, I'm assuming you've either beaten the game, and if you haven't, well, sorry. On the whole, I think 16's story is good, but not fantastic. It unfortunately falls into the all-too-common trap of the longer it goes on, the less compelling it becomes. It starts out very strong and gives Clive a clear and understandable motivation for his actions. He wants to find out who he thinks murdered his brother and exact revenge. He has been surviving as a branded soldier on the front lines of the Holy Empire for 13 years for this reason and this reason alone. Then, when he accepts the truth that he was Joshua's killer, not really of course, but he doesn't know that at the time, he resolves himself to atone not only for that and Phoenix Gate, but for all the killing he's done in service of what was effectively a red herring of his own creation. He joins Cid's cause officially and vows to help create a better world where people can live and die on their own terms. This is a really compelling arc for Clive as a character, and it makes perfect sense. Clive has always seen himself as someone who fights on behalf of other people. He was the first shield of Rosaria so that he could always fight for and protect his younger brother. Now he's accepted the truth of what happened at Phoenix Gate, that flame has been relit inside of him, and he's ready to continue fighting for people once more. In the background, while Clive's story is progressing, there's a pretty interesting subplot about the fate of Valistia. All the wars that are ongoing in Valistia are due to the continual spread of the Blight. As nations run out of livable territory, they invade the lands of their neighbors so they can absorb those territories into their own and attempt to prolong their existence and quality of life as the Blight spreads over more and more of the twins. This is tied into Clive's story very well because it's revealed by Cid that the mother crystals upon which all of Valistian society is based around are in fact the cause of the Blight. So it makes sense that creating a world where people can live and die on their own terms would first require making that world livable in the first place. Thus, their goal is clear: destroy the Mother Crystals so that Valistia can survive. The motivations for the characters and the reasoning behind these global conflicts feels like the stage is being set for what could have been a truly unforgettable journey that involves a wide cast of interesting characters that have to come together and find a solution to a problem that can't be ignored any longer. At least that's what it felt like they were leading up to during the first act of the game. Unfortunately, this does not come to pass. At a certain point, it becomes abundantly clear that this is not going to be a truly unforgettable journey that involves a wide cast of interesting characters that have to come together to find a solution to the problem that can't be ignored any longer. This is not really a story about the fate of Valistia or the people who live in it. This is a story about Super Chad Clive Rossfield and how he saves the day. FF16 is Clive's story through and through, and this comes at the detriment of basically everything else. The overall narrative, the characters, and especially the themes of the game all feel pretty barren when compared to the hyper-focus that is put on Clive. Take the characters, for example. Most of the main cast feel as if they exist to bounce off of or support Clive in some way, and everything else about them is secondary. Ultima is obsessed with taking over Clive's body and seemingly masterminds the entire plot of the game explicitly for this purpose. Annabella betrays her family in large part because Clive didn't awaken as the Phoenix, and the shame he brought onto her because of that. Joshua puts himself through the ringer and spends most of the game suffering to protect Clive from Ultima, and in the end sacrifices himself for Clive. Jill stands by Clive's side for the whole game and usually just echoes what Clive already says and thinks, and has to be rescued by Clive on 2 occasions. Barnabas, as an extension of Ultima's will, does what he does in service of making Clive a suitable vessel for Ultima, and even gets his own "finally a worthy opponent" moment when fighting Clive. Hugo spends the majority of his screen time seething over Clive's existence to the point that he imagines himself getting cucked by Clive. To be fair, there are some exceptions to this dynamic, but in those cases, the characters are either out of the story way too soon, like Benedicta, or eventually come around to the #Clive Hive anyway, like Sid and Dion. As for the minor characters, Clive is either explicitly their leader, or goes around solving all their problems single-handedly. And I get it, it's an RPG, that's kind of par for the course for RPGs to have the protagonist going around solving everyone's problems. That's not a new thing. But when you compare Clive's capabilities to what anyone else can do in this world, it really evokes a sense that most of these people would be utterly fucked without Clive. Consider the late-game side quests that involve Clive protecting one of the towns from a small army of Akashic. In each of these quests, it's emphasized that the town has to rally together to survive the upcoming onslaught, but in reality, Clive is doing everything. Obviously, in an action game, you're going to be handling the threats yourself, but the clear and obvious gap between Clive and the townspeople really undermines the whole thematic premise of these quests. Speaking of themes, let's talk about those for a moment. FF16 goes for an overtly dark tone and features a lot of heavy subject matter. War, violence, revenge, sexual abuse, slavery, prejudice, these are all things that appear in 16's story to a greater or lesser degree. I don't have an issue with a game trying to tell a story that includes this kind of dark, more serious content. As a general rule, I don't think anything that occurs in the real world should be off limits for art and storytelling. But I struggled for a while to put into words why the darker stuff in FF16 didn't really land for me the same way that it does in something like Berserk or A Song of Ice and Fire, which this game supposedly pulls heavily from. I think the best way that I can put it is that a lot of the darker content in 16 feels like it pops in to say hello and is then yoinked away about as quickly as it appeared. In other words, it doesn't feel like there's an appropriate amount of build-up or payoff for a lot of these darker moments. Here are some examples from side quests to kind of show what I'm talking about. In Sanbreque, there are 2 quests you can do back-to-back called Playthings and All Bark. In Playthings, a little girl asks you to find her lost pet, Chloe. You go to the area marked on the map, and it turns out the lost pet was actually a slave that ran away and has since died. The little girl shows up and bemoans that she'll need another new pet now. Clive then basically explains human rights to her, and then she starts crying and the quest ends. Another quest called All Bark sees Clive coming to the aid of some noble to save his son who is being attacked by wolves. Clive dispatches the wolves and saves the kid, but it turns out this was a setup where Clive was supposed to get killed by the wolves for the amusement of the child, as was the case for two unfortunate bearers before Clive. Then the father and son, totally outraged by Clive's unwillingness to let himself be murdered for a giggle, say they're going to get an even bigger and meaner wolf to deal with him. While burying the two dead bearers, Clive hears the sound of said newly acquired giant wolf mauling the father and son to death. Then the quest ends. The problem here is that these snapshots into the darker side of Valistia never feel truly organic. It's not some gruesome story or detail of the world you discovered on your own. It's a side quest with a big green marker on the map begging you to experience it. Then once it's over, it's back to things as usual. Despite the awful events you just witnessed, you go right back into traversing Valistia with the serene and beautiful music playing in the background as you take in the awe-inspiring vistas. It feels like a tonal dissonance. Dark story content isn't the kind of thing you can dole out on a semi-frequent basis in a side quest format. It becomes far less effective because the very nature of these MMO-style quests demands that the story doesn't take too much of your time and can't be too complex or involved. I think the content of these quests is fine, generally speaking, and obviously not every quest is about slaves being murdered or children being eaten. But this is some pretty heavy shit, and I think more consideration should have been put into how these stories would be shown to the player. The current format only reinforces how artificial they feel, which weakens the message. This feeling of a lack of proper build-up or payoff is also prevalent in the main story as well. Benedicta is a great example of this. She gets some very solid build-up, and then there's absolutely no payoff. After she's defeated, she, in pretty quick succession, has her icon stolen, is almost raped, and is then killed. Not much time after that, we find out that her corpse was defiled, with her head being sent in a box to Hugo. The Iron Kingdom is another example. This place we have basically no attachment to or context for is also where mass child rape and sacrifice is occurring. Then we destroy the crystal, and nothing about anything that was going on there ever comes up again. How about Clive's 13 years as a slave soldier fighting on the front lines of the Empire? That whole part of his life is kind of just never really expanded on or given any sort of space in the story for him to talk about it. Seems like a dark time for him that would be worth exploring for the sake of his character. But nope, we just get this one guy, Tiamat, who apparently trained Clive, and then that's literally all we know about him, and then we kill him. Seems like a relationship that would have been worth exploring, but I guess not. Now, take the setting. Valistia is pretty interesting, and I enjoyed it. There was clearly a lot of effort put into making it feel like a fleshed out world, but it does fail on some basic world building levels because everything has to be about Clive saving the day. The treatment of bearers, or branded, whatever you want to call them, is a good example. Branded are the slave class of people who are treated as objects to be discarded once their usefulness has run dry. But why would this be universally the same across all the nations of Valistia? Are you telling me that all of these places are culturally different and unique from one another, except for their views on the super consequential issue of slavery? Why would all bearers be treated the same in different nations? The only reason I can think of is that there always needs to be bearers for Clive to save in every part of the world, but this really does flatten the supposed differences between these nations. This is made worse by the fact that FF16 is supposed to be Game of Thrones inspired, or Song of Ice and Fire, and Game of Thrones does in fact have this nuance when it comes to its world building. FF16 should have had its own nation like Dorne. For those unaware, Dorne is the southernmost kingdom on the continent of Westeros in the Game of Thrones world. Dorne has a pretty distinct culture when compared to the other 6 kingdoms. Sex and otherwise hedonistic behavior are not frowned upon in Dorne like they are in the other kingdoms. Bastard children don't face anywhere near the level of prejudice in Dorne that they do in the other kingdoms. Women are allowed to inherit land and titles in Dorne, same as men, and Dorne is presented as just a overall different kind of environment when compared to the rest of Westeros, maybe say for the north, which also has its own unique environment, but all of the kingdoms have this kind of nuance. In FF16, the Dhalmekian Republic seems like it's supposed to be the Dorne equivalent of Valistia. It's to the south, it's got a desert landscape with a hot arid climate, its people have dark skin, and its system of government is different from the rest of the world. It's a republic, it's not a monarchy. And yet, things in Dhalmek seem to function exactly the same as they would anywhere else. This lack of nuance hurts the setting because it feels like it was built around the fact that Clive is going to be liberating these bearers. Almost everything comes back to Clive. And don't get me wrong, Clive is a great character. He's definitely among my favorite protagonists in the franchise now. He's very much a distinct departure from the sort of characters that have been in leading roles in FF games up to this point, which I find really refreshing. I'll talk more about him in the characters section, but I think FF16 would have been way less tolerable overall if Clive wasn't as great as he is. But regardless of how great Clive is, it's just a fact that among all the mainline FF games, none of them have such a laser focus on just the protagonist to the degree that FF16 does. Even when Clive is not the primary subject of the story in a particular moment, he's still the guy who has to handle things at the end of the day because he's the only playable character, and events will always culminate in a fight where Clive takes care of whatever issue has arisen. Look at the Iron Kingdom portion of the game. This is supposed to be Jill's moment in the story, the part of the game dedicated to expanding on her as a character, and yet, when we get to the end of the level, Jill is relegated to defending herself from Liquid Flame and creating and maintaining the boss arena so Clive can do the actual fighting. It's great that she gets to kill the evil priest on her own, but that guy is barely a character and is introduced as quickly as he's killed off. If no one but Clive is going to be playable in the game, then why couldn't we have some QTE moments in boss fights where other characters get to do some cool shit? It would certainly make them feel more involved. As it stands, Jill plays second fiddle to Clive in the resolution to her own character arc. And good lord, the ending of the game where she gets left behind while Clive, Joshua, and Dion fly off to confront Ultima, what the fuck is that? If it was just Clive and Joshua, okay, I would understand because there would be an arc there. It's a story about the Brothers of Fire. We start our story with the Brothers of Fire, we end it with the Brothers of Fire. But Dion also gets to go, and the reason is basically, I'm built different. I wish I was exaggerating. The only defense that you can make is that Clive wouldn't want his lover to go on a mission where it's likely none of them are coming back from, but it's like, shouldn't that be her decision? Like, fucking hell, the world is at stake. I think people are allowed to risk their lives for that. FF games, up to this point, have always been a team effort, even when there is a clear main character, so I can't blame any longtime fans for feeling alienated by 16's approach. I loved Clive, but even I was starting to feel this way by the end of the game. Speaking of the end of the game, just like everything else, it has some incredible highs and some very disappointing lows. I thoroughly enjoyed most everything that was happening in the plot up until your first actual fight with Barnabas, the one where you get to fight him but you can't actually win. Firstly, it is unforgivable that the impetus for this situation is Jill getting captured for the second time. It really undermines the idea that Jill is a strong woman when she is kidnapped and has to be rescued twice in the main plot. I don't care that it was because she stepped in to protect Clive after he was injured. Come up with something else. Secondly, after the fight with Barnabas, where Clive gets slashed across the chest again, he goes into this rambling speech about God that I found pretty difficult to follow. Clive and Jill clearly felt the same way because their only response is to basically say, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Until eventually Clive spells it out in plain language that Barnabas wants to turn everyone Akashic. And this, I think, is where the plot is going to lose a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of the endgame stuff in this story is not explained in the story itself. You have to read the tomes in the Hideaway to make sense of what Barnabas is talking about, which is a real shame because I do think it's pretty cool. To me, this stretch of the game really solidified in my mind that these side quests should have just been cut so we could dedicate more time to exposition and providing context in the main narrative. I do not blame anyone for feeling confused about the ending or all of the exposition leading up to it because the game does not take the time to go into it in the way that it should. I'm not saying games need to spoon feed you the plot or that some information shouldn't be hidden in side quests or whatnot. That's what an RPG is. You shouldn't be getting all of the information from just cutscenes in the main story. But when a massively important character is giving their speech that elaborates on their motivations, I should be able to know what they're talking about without having done homework. This extends beyond Barnabas to Ultima as well. If you don't read the tomes, you will have no idea what Logos or Primogenesis is. Two pretty important concepts to the narrative, if you ask me. Before we get to the final stretch of the game, I want to highlight several moments where there are gaps in the narrative that should have been addressed in a more meaningful way. I want to stress again that my playtime was 74 hours and I didn't even get 100% completion. When you consider how long I spent with this game, it's pretty inexcusable that a lot of the context surrounding the events of the game are not given their due. The tomes should be something that expand upon what is already there for people who are interested. They should not be required reading. I'm just going to shotgun these so as to not spend too much time on this. Right at the start, when Clive is reunited with Torgal, there's like no fanfare whatsoever, despite not having seen his beloved hound in 13 years. They come together like they had just seen each other the day before. How Joshua survived the incident in Phoenix Gate and how he was recovered by the Undying is just totally glossed over, as well as whatever his research into Ultima's origins was. The Fallen are not expanded upon at all and just feel like an afterthought, despite their technology being such a prominent thing that affects the world to this day. The origins of the Icons are not clear at all. Barnabas claims that the Icons exist to give power to Mythos so that he can reach his full potential, but one, that's not really an explanation, and two, one of the Icons, Leviathan, has apparently been lost to time, so how can Mythos reach his full potential? The Iron Kingdom is just a total nothing. We go there once and fuck off after destroying the crystal, never to be concerned with it again. I'm sure there are other things I've missed, but I think my point is clear. Okay, getting back to the final stretch of the game. To put it simply, Barnabas is a devout follower of the Circle of Malleus. This is the religion that is mentioned once or twice that worships Ultima as their god until most of them were wiped out for being viewed as heretics, including Barnabas' mother. This caused Barnabas to develop a hatred for humanity, and it's why Ultima uses his mother's image to manipulate him. But if you don't know this context, you might just think Barnabas has an Oedipus complex or some shit. The circle is symbolized by that mural of all the icons that we see several times throughout the game. They believe that human free will is the ultimate cause of evil in the world because human free will leads to hatred, greed, envy, war, and so on. Therefore, the only path to salvation is to give up their free will and surrender themselves to their god, Ultima. In doing so, they will be accepted into the paradise that Ultima is going to create via Mythos. What I really like about this is that it's all total bullshit. Ultima has absolutely no intention of including humanity in the new world that he's seeking to create. He's been manipulating Barnabas since minute one. Ultima has nothing but contempt and disdain for his creations that dare to gain a will of their own. Humanity was nothing more than an inferior species to be raised like cattle until Mythos finally appears, at which point the rest of them do not matter. Ultima simply needs Mythos to cast the spell Raise and create a new world free of the Blight. I wouldn't say any of these endgame reveals were totally blowing my mind. Whether you're fighting a literal god or a godlike being, this is well-trodden ground for JRPGs and especially for Final Fantasy. On some level, this feels very deliberate in its invoking of JRPG tropes. Clive even drops a line at some point to the effect of, "We'll do what we have to do, even if it means killing a god." And I guess I just wanted something more original or not as played out in the genre for the next mainline Final Fantasy. It's not bad, but it doesn't really evoke much of a reaction from me, nor does it really make me think all that much. It's all just playing it too safe, which really just describes the game as a whole, to be honest. Everything works, but it feels like they were afraid to take any real risks, outside of just, the horrible dark stuff. It also feels kind of Dune-esque. Like Ultima is the Bene Gesserit and Clive is the Kwisatz Haderach. I don't know if anyone else is going to think that, but I do wonder if Dune was an inspiration. Also on the topic of inspiration, another one that was mentioned a few times in the lead up to FF16 and one that I've talked about already was Game of Thrones. Now, I am a Song of Ice and Fire head through and through, so when I was playing this game, I was on the lookout for parallels between the two. And there's some noticeable stuff if you're familiar with the Song of Ice and Fire lore and so on. So I'll just cover that real quick. Clive is clearly Jon Snow inspired. He's a somewhat sullen youth skilled in the sword with a secret destiny as a child of fire. He also has a mother figure that hates and resents him for what he apparently represents. Annabella even says that people assumed Clive was a bastard. He also has a loyal wolf companion from the frozen northern region of the world. Elwyn, Clive's father, was renowned for his honorable nature and is killed in front of his children like Ned Stark. Annabella feels very Cersei-esque, a beautiful power-hungry blonde that obsesses over her children and marries into power. Jill is taken as a ward of Rosaria after her kingdom loses a war, just like Theon Greyjoy. Joshua is the younger son of a ruler who suffers an early injury in life that sets him down a path he never imagined and has a connection with a mystical bird like Bran Stark. Ultima is kind of similar to the Night King from the show in that he's sort of a blue-looking guy who wants to create a new world that wipes out humanity. Maybe that's a stretch. Goots is kind of like Hodor in that he's a huge, strong guy that's kind of a simpleton. And lastly, Clive and Jill, the male and female leads of the game, who are romantically involved with each other, represent fire and ice. Jon and Daenerys, the male and female leads of the show, at least, who are also romantically involved with each other, represent ice and fire. So, I definitely see some of the influence here. I wouldn't say it really enhances the game on its own, but, I don't think it detracts from it either. It's just kind of a neat thing you can pick up on if you're both a fan of Final Fantasy and Song of Ice and Fire. Okay, getting back to the ending. So, Ultima is apparently multiple entities with a shared consciousness. Those other versions of Ultima became the Mother Crystals and were residing inside the cores of those crystals, and when Clive destroyed those cores, they were released so they could all rejoin back into one entity. Okay. It sure does seem like Joshua's sealing of Ultima inside him was totally worthless and didn't accomplish anything in the end. And apparently everything that occurred in the game was part of Ultima's plan, so none of the choices we were actually making were our own, ? I want to stress that I have no issue with these revelations in a vacuum. I'm very much okay with finding out that everything was part of the villain's keikaku. What doesn't sit right with me is that it seems like, again, this chain of events clashes with the themes of the game, at least in regards to the main narrative. Human free will and the ability to live and die on our own terms was something they constantly hammered home, but I guess none of that was actually real until the very end of the game, because in the grand scheme, we were just doing what Ultima wanted. And despite all the talk of doing things together, Clive leaves Jill behind at the end to mournfully watch as he flies away to fight the bad guy. Dion and Joshua both die before the real battle takes place. Jill explicitly tells Clive that he can't just protect other people, he needs to protect himself too, and yet, in the end, he still sacrifices himself. So, it feels to me that, again, there is a dissonance here. It's super lame that the boring side quests actually explore the themes of the game better than the main story does. I'll play devil's advocate against myself for a second here. I believe the intention of the writers was that they were supposed to view the theme of togetherness and willpower in the sense of Clive is fighting so hard and with such ferocity because he so badly wants to protect the people he loves. It's like when Gohan defeats Cell with his one-armed Kamehameha because Goku was with him. Not literally, but in spirit. He's standing behind him. And I'm fine with that. I love shonen. Sometimes it is more effective to have one person be the hero and everyone else take a step back. But the problem is 16 wants you to feel like it's evoking the same level of togetherness as the previous entries in the franchise without reflecting this in the game itself, which makes it feel unearned. Take, for example, the final bosses of Final Fantasies 6, 9, and 10. In 6, you have to create a queue of all your playable characters before the final boss, so that if one of them is KO'd at the end of a phase, they are replaced by the next character in the queue. In theory, every character can participate. In 9, you have to choose a party of 4 among your 8 options, and the 4 characters you don't choose literally do a shonen-esque transfer of power to your final party. They are literally giving you their strength. And of course, in 10, the whole party is swappable at any time, so they can all participate. I know the hypothetical response to this is, it's an action game. Of course you're going to do everything as the main character. And that wouldn't be incorrect. But in the games that FF16 gets compared to, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, etc., these games don't labor under the pretense that the protagonist isn't doing everything on their own. And even then, they're not, still not doing everything on their own. They have a support system around them, but they're still the badass at the end of the day. But imagine if in FF16 there was some kind of DBZ spirit bomb moment where all the bearers sort of raise their hands up, transfer their power to Clive so he can create a more just world on their behalf, or something like that. It would make sense because Clive is supposed to be this conduit for incredible power. And I think something like that would feel right at home in a game like this. All that being said, I was very happy to see them do something adjacent to the spirit bomb idea for the end of the game. The ending sequence and the final boss are fucking fantastic. Even though it wasn't the most challenging fight ever, they do actually incorporate the themes pretty well into the final boss fight. When all the cinematic clashes of icon versus icon happen and you hear the voices of your companions in the background and you're just mashing the square button, I was ecstatic. It's simple but extremely effective. Name-dropping Final Fantasy in your ending line against the bad guy is corny as shit, but I still loved it at the end of the day because it's, perfect for a character like Clive. Plus, that final punch is just mwah. So with Ultima defeated, Clive absorbs his power and can essentially do whatever he wants with it. There's been some debate about what actually happens in the ending cutscene here. My understanding is that Clive absorbs Ultima into himself, revives Joshua, destroys Origin, and creates a world without magic so the blight can no longer spread. Clive finds himself on a beach, having clearly exceeded the limits of even his status as Mythos, and has succumbed to the crystal's curse. After the credits, we cut to some indeterminate period of time later, when icons and magic are now the stuff of legends, and humans no longer have to be concerned by the threat of the blight. These legends seemingly came from a book called Final Fantasy, authored by Joshua Rossfield. I liked everything I was seeing up until the post-credits scene. This ending is utterly bewildering to me. Why are we cutting to some 1,000 years later type shit? Why aren't we seeing the characters we've come to know and love making their way in the new world that Clive has just created, that he just sacrificed himself for? The ending cutscene shows Edda having given birth after Clive has died. There is a synchronicity here. One life ends and a new one begins. A new dawn has risen in Valistia. So if we're doing a time skip, why the fuck are we not seeing the new world through the eyes of this child grown up? This is such an easy slam dunk that they just didn't do it for some reason. Like, it almost writes itself. It's so obvious. This child could grow up with stepdad Gav, the new leader of the Hideaway, having been told the wondrous tale of the great Clive Rossfield and the great Cid before him. Maybe they're a cadet on Mid's airship exploring new lands. Maybe they become the new leader of the Hideaway down the line. Maybe they establish a new nation where people can live and die on their own terms. Annabella said a new nation can always be founded if one fails. Or maybe they just live an honest, peaceful life of quiet serendipity. No magic, no problem. They were born in a world without magic, so it's not something they ever missed. Maybe this child of Edda becomes friends with the hypothetical child of Clive and Jill. I mean, those two definitely fucked on that beach, so if we're going to be made to see two kids playing with each other in the new world, then why is it two randoms we have no attachment to? Two randoms that are brothers, by the way. Brothers with the same hair color as Clive and Joshua, and a puppy that looks like Torgal. That is some real hack shit right there. I can't begin to fathom what they were thinking with this ending. What happened to our friends we fought so hard for? Where is the closure? Why are only Gav and Jill allowed to be sad? Everyone came to see us off before we flew to Origin. Surely they would have some kind of reaction to the news about their beloved friend and leader. There's absolutely no benefit to just leaving this huge thing a blank, just leaving this all a blank. It's just such a kick in the balls. Okay. Now we're going to talk about characters. Man, alright. Characters. I think, on the whole, FF16 has a pretty phenomenal cast of characters. There are certainly some hard misses, but I think there are way more hits. So how we'll do this is I'll just give a rundown on my thoughts on each of the main cast, and then do a quick tally of all the side characters that I feel are worth mentioning because, whether they had memorable moments or were otherwise likable. So starting with Clive. I loved Clive. Easily one of the best parts of the game. He's fucking cool as hell. He's compelling. He's got a great arc. He's got a ton of great one-liners, surprisingly, and he made me laugh several times. He has a great chemistry with the rest of the cast. He's just really phenomenal from top to bottom. Clive really does stand out from all other FF protagonists up to this point because, among other things, he's the first himbo to grace the franchise in a leading role. I love pretty boys and gals as much as the next guy, but things were very due for a shakeup in my opinion. For a game that's totally focused on its protagonist, I'm glad they understood that he needs to be good. There are very few moments in games that have made me feel the way that press L3 plus R3 to accept the truth made me feel. My pronouns are he, they, because I'll never be him. Hashtag CliveHive, hashtag Clive's journey is similar to my own. Jill. Man, Jill is a very likable character that is not given her due and is not allowed to be as good as she could have been. With the exception of a few moments, every opportunity the story had to make Jill do something cool or memorable or genuinely interesting, she just doesn't. Her main role within the game is to not participate as much as she should, get kidnapped, spend time in the infirmary, or directly support Clive. The section of the story dedicated to her arc is the most underdeveloped part of the game and introduces characters we literally never see again once it's over. Is she a totally blank slate? No, absolutely not. But similar to most things in this game, her potential is unrealized. It's very upsetting that the only two women dominants in this game are either underdeveloped or underutilized. Hashtag justice for Jill. Benedicta. Benedicta is another fantastic character that is sadly gone from the story way too soon. Every time she was on screen, I was thoroughly entertained. She has a fantastic presence in every scene that she's in, and easily one of the best characters in the game despite how little we see of her compared to the other dominants. It's a testament to how well the character is written that we see so many sides of her in what little time we get to spend with her. Really, the only flaw in regards to Benedicta as a character is that there's not enough of her. Cid. Cid rocks so hard. He's probably the most universally adored character in this game, rivaling Clive, and it's really not hard to understand why. He has an instantly magnetic personality with endless charm and wit. He's funny, wise, and humble with a heart of gold on top of it all. Cid is the kind of guy we all need in our lives. Someone to give us a helping hand when we stumble and a kick in the ass when we go the wrong way. Similar to Benedicta, his only real flaw is that there's just not enough of him. Cid is instantly one of the best Cids in the franchise, if not the best. And if you don't like him, then I can only pity you because you have no joy in your heart, clearly. Hugo. I find Hugo to be a pretty great mid-game antagonist. He's intimidating, confident, and clearly knows how to throw his weight around. He's also far more calculating and pragmatic than you would initially expect from someone who probably could have been written off as a mindless brute before you actually see that side of him. He's kind of Lex Luthor-esque in that he's a bald guy with a massive ego who understands that economic power is actually better than being like a direct head of state in most cases. He gives us a personal reason to hate him when he destroys the hideaway, and his arc takes a totally unexpected turn that I was absolutely loving. When his hands get cut off, I was not expecting him to go through a mini cuck arc, but shit, that's what we got. Hugo is a great inclusion to the game. Joshua. I like Joshua, but too much of his story is left unsaid. Joshua is the main reference point for Clive's character arc and is also our main point of contact when it comes to Ultima. And yet, we don't get anything more than a few lines of dialogue about what he's been up to this whole time before we're reintroduced to him, how he actually survived at Phoenix Gate, how he learned about Ultima, how he was able to seal Ultima within him and get out of that underground area after it seeming collapsed on himself, you know? I do enjoy that Joshua starts out as a kid who can't seem to handle his power that he's born with and then grows up to be a fully fledged dominant. But there are too many gaps in his storyline. His interactions with Clive and Dion are really great, but he's another example of a character that exists to bounce off Clive and less, sort of be his own person. If we get a DLC that covers Joshua's time before reuniting with Clive, I'm going to be pissed because that should have just been in the game. Dion. Dion is a fantastic character from start to finish, and he gets way more of a character arc than you would initially expect. It does kind of bother me that he is example number 3 among the dominants whose arc revolves around seeking redemption for having killed a bunch of people. But I guess it makes sense when you consider that dominants are basically walking nuclear weapons and losing control can result in horrible tragedy, which is exactly what happens with Dion. Once he was introduced and it became clear that he was not at all a bad guy, I was very curious as to what our reasoning was going to be for having to fight him. What I don't love is this. So, he loses control due to the shock of having killed his father, which is why we're forced to fight him. But later on, when he wants to join us in fighting Ultima, and Clive tells him that the icons no longer submit to the will of those who lost their powers to Clive, Dion's response is, I guess I'll just have to be built different. And I guess it makes sense in the context of the theme of willpower, but you'd think the guy who's trying to make amends for the shit he did when he lost control would be a little less cavalier about this. I don't know, it's kind of weird. In any case, I really enjoy learning that Harpocrates was Dion's tutor, and the two have a fantastic scene together, and it's cool that arguably the strongest of the dominants is openly gay. So let's get more stuff like this in JRPGs, please. Barnabas. Barnabas is Clive's Virgil. I'm not the first person to make that comparison, and I surely won't be the last, but people say it because it's true. He looks similar to Clive. He's the dominant with the most fights against Clive, where he bodies him the first 2 times, and when you beat him, he grants Judgment Cut. I think Barnabas is very cool. He's built up throughout the game as an extraordinarily powerful and mysterious figure within the world, and overcoming him is very satisfying when you finally do it. Unfortunately, his motivations are not explained properly in the story, which is a total disservice to him. And above everything else, I really think he should have just been the main antagonist. There's a version of this game in my mind where Ultima is revealed to the player and is built up to be the bad guy who's been using the devout Barnabas as a tool to achieve his goals, but then Barnabas pulls a Kefka and turns on his master to acquire godlike power for himself. Perhaps because he finds out that Ultima is full of shit and has no intention of creating a paradise for his followers. Feeling betrayed by both humanity and the god he's worshipped all his life, he has a breakdown and decides to create a new world of his own, or just goes full nihilist and decides that if even God can't be relied upon, then nothing is worth protecting. As it stands, I think it kind of sucks that, as great as he is, he's just another henchman you have to get through to make your way to the actual villain of the story, Ultima. Ultima sucks. He is probably the worst character in this game because he's the main antagonist who commits the greatest sin that any main antagonist can. He's boring. He has no juice, no sauce, no swag. He has no personality until the very end of the game when he starts losing. His design is lame. He's not particularly intimidating. He speaks in this robotic, monotone delivery for 99% of the game. His origin is not particularly clear. His plan is not particularly clear unless you read the tomes in the Hideaway, and even then, it's just kind of stupid. As I understand it, Ultima and his kin fled their own world because magic, the thing they created, was causing the blight, something which even they were not immune to the effects of. So, they discarded their physical bodies and traveled across the cosmos until they came across Valistia. However, the blight came with them, so they decided that the most logical course of action was to enact a millennia-long plan to remake the world via mythos. But it's not at all clear why remaking the world would do anything about the blight when the obvious cause of the problem is magic. I think the intention here is to highlight that Ultima himself is too proud to understand or accept that his own plan would never actually work, thus showing that he is in fact a flawed being and not so different from the humans he looks down on. That is the only part of the character that I think works, and everything else is lame. Okay, that's the primary cast out of the way. For the side characters, I'll group them based on whatever faction they belong to, starting with the Hideaway. I'll just list characters that I liked. Gav, Otto, Tarja, Blackthorn, Goots, Karen, Mid, Vivian, Harpocrates, and Nectar. I liked them all. Every time there was a major story development, I would walk around the Hideaway to see these characters, how they were faring, and if they had thoughts on the current state of things, which they often did. FF16 may lack a traditional party, but it certainly does not lack in characters that I thoroughly enjoyed interacting with. Especially at the Hideaway, which is where you're going to be spending most of your downtime, so I'm really pleased to see that they nailed this. Rosaria. Elwyn, Annabella, Sir Wade, Uncle Byron, Lord Commander Murdoch, and Martha were all good, but in very different ways. Particularly Annabella and Uncle Byron. Clive's mother, Annabella, is a pretty shallow character, but I can't deny that I was very entertained every time she was on screen because of just the incredible hater energy that she projected at all times. So, on that level, I do have to respect her. However, Annabella is another character that suffers from a meaningful lack of exposition because, in hindsight, it seems like she was being manipulated by Ultima, just like everyone else. But even just a single line or scene that shows that would have made her character a much easier pill to swallow. As it stands, she can easily be slotted into the cartoonishly evil category of character that appears in FF games from time to time. Uncle Byron was a character that came totally out of left field for me, and I was shocked at how much I enjoyed him. He's both hilarious and has plenty of great characterization. When Clive proves his identity by acting out their favorite scene from The Saint and the Secretary, that is one of my favorite moments in the whole game. Phenomenal. Sanbreque. Isabel and Quentin are the standouts of Sanbreque. I like them both, and I like their backstories, particularly seeing how Isabel toys with Clive's awkwardness and all things seductive was quite entertaining. Dhalmekian Republic. Eloise, Theodore, and Lubor are definitely the standouts of the Dhalmekian Republic. Particularly the tragic nature of how Eloise and Theo's story ends was a great moment. Also watching Lubor fuck with Uncle Byron while Clive just sort of stands there not saying anything got a legitimate laugh out of me. Finally, the Iron Kingdom. The Iron Kingdom does not have any characters worth mentioning. The whole section is undercooked. Fuck you. Alright, and now we're in the final part of the game, the presentation. This will probably be the shortest part of the video because I basically have nothing bad to say about anything in regards to the game's presentation and production values, because those are the most obviously correct parts of the game, even though you could argue that, them being so good does probably detract from other things that could have occurred. But I think that's more of an issue with games in general right now, not just FF16. Visuals. FF16 looks unbelievably incredible. There were several times playing this game that I thought, God damn, the power of the PS5 is something else. Like, this is the next gen. I haven't felt this level of holy shit when playing a new release since, I want to say, Elden Ring, and before that, I could not tell you. The environments look amazing and wonderfully detailed. The character models look amazing and wonderfully detailed. The character designs in this game are really, really top-notch. I can't think of anyone that bothered me even slightly. Maybe the only thing that bothered me in any part of the character designs was the fact that Cid carries two swords but just doesn't use one of them. I'm not sure what that was about. The icon designs are amazing. The battle effects, amazing. Just anything to do with visual in this game, fucking amazing. And Square Enix proves yet again that no other company can really match them in this regard. Like, it's kind of fucking insane that Square has just never really been usurped as having the overall best visual design and fidelity since, like, the fucking SNES era of Final Fantasy. Not everything they do is, like, a winner, but their peak always rises far above the peak of whatever else their competitors are doing, and FF16 is showing us that once again. All that being said, I really don't think games need to look any better than this. You could argue they don't need to look this good now, and I think you could make a serious case that they don't need to look better than what Square was producing in the FF13 era, because when you play those games on like a modern PC, they still look utterly amazing. And they were just kind of hampered by their original hardware when they first came out, but the fidelity in the design was still there. I absolutely love how 16 looks, but I hope Square doesn't go to great lengths to continue to push their visual fidelity, because the returns would just not be worth it. I'm very much happy and willing to play a game that doesn't look good as FF16 for advantages in other areas. Voice acting. I played the English dub. FF16's voice acting was top-notch from beginning to end. Like, I really don't need to say much else. Some side characters, I think there was one side character that I had trouble understanding, but I had subtitles, so it didn't really matter. But if I heard the line without subtitles, I probably would have gone, huh? It's really thick, like, Cockney British accent. Just a lot of aggressively British characters in this game. But everyone in the main cast totally nailed their role. Just absolutely, positively fantastic work all around. Even Ultima, whose delivery is totally monotone, like, that's clearly an intentional choice, so I can't even say it's poor voice acting because they accomplished what they set out to do. I'm just not a fan of what they set out to do, but, that's a different thing entirely. I would say the standout roles for me were Clive, Cid, Benedicta, Barnabas, Hugo, and Annabella. Sound design. Sound design was another aspect of this game that I just have no complaints about whatsoever. They understood the assignment, and they get top fucking marks. I particularly loved the sounds of combat, which felt appropriately crunchy, punchy, slashy, stabby, burny, shocky, freezy, and, whatever the made-up words you want to use. I've seen a lot of people describe the sound effects as PS2 core, and yeah, that is super accurate. It did often sound like I was playing an Onimusha on the PS2 or something like that. Just really phenomenal from top to bottom. Cutscenes. The cutscene direction in this game is both in and out of battle. Holy fucking shit. So many utterly jaw-dropping moments. So many moments that had me shouting at the hype of what I was seeing on screen. The fight choreography, the camera work, the editing, all of it, just stellar. I'm being totally serious when I say FF16 is worth the price of admission just for experiencing these moments in the game unspoiled. I can't find enough positive adjectives to accurately describe just how far they knocked it out of the park. Great googly moogly. And finally we come to the music. Good God. I'm sure I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know when I say that Final Fantasy is a franchise very much renowned for its unmatched quantity of unbelievably high-quality music. Being a composer for this franchise, particularly at this stage in its life, must be such an incredibly stressful undertaking. Everything you make is going to be put under such a microscope compared to other games because of what you have to live up to. Consider the names that have composed for this franchise thus far. Nobuo Uematsu, arguably the greatest game composer of all time. Yoko Shimomura, also arguably the greatest game composer of all time. Masashi Hamauzu, an incredible talent brought into Square Enix by Uematsu himself because he was so impressed with him. Hitoshi Sakamoto and Kumi Tanioka, both of whom are totally underrated and certainly underappreciated for their incredible contributions to the franchise, if you ask me. No matter what it is, if a game has Final Fantasy in the title, you can be assured beyond doubt that it's going to have some incredible fucking music. Now, I was not particularly familiar with Masayoshi Soken before playing FF16. I knew that he was the lead composer for FF14 and that people seem to really love what he's done there, but to be frank, I've still barely scratched the surface of that game. I've loved what I've heard so far from FF14, but I know it only amounts to a small portion of the man's repertoire. So, having played FF16 now, I can confidently say that based on this soundtrack alone, Soken very much deserves to stand among the giants that came before him. Excuse me. What a fucking triumph this soundtrack is. What a fucking incredible work of art that deserves all the praise it's been getting and then some. I've not stopped listening to this music since I beat the game, and I don't think I'm going to stop for a long ass time. And this shit isn't even out on streaming services yet. I've been listening to low quality YouTube rips and covers. I don't even care because it just goes so fucking hard. Also want to shout out the other composers who contributed to this game: Takafumi Imamura and Daiki Ishikawa and Saya Yasaki and Justin Frieden. Because some of my favorite tracks in the game were even by Soken himself, so big ups to everyone else involved. Okay, let's wrap this up. Like I said at the very beginning, FF16 is a good game that does not reach its full potential. It's a strange combination of lacking in some areas like the combat and RPG elements, but overcompensating in others like the side content or the difficulty. I feel like this image really describes what it's like to play FF16. When this game is hitting its stride and we're schmoovin', it feels like we are more back than we have ever been, but when it's not, it feels like it's so fucking over. And that applies to basically everything about this game, from combat to progression to story to characters. I don't even think this game needs to be totally redesigned from the ground up to improve it in a pretty substantial way. If the combat just had a bit more depth to it, like combo modifiers, magic shots doing different things, party members being more impactful, and a greater focus on status effects or buffs and debuffs, then I think a combat system that's already pretty damn fun would have felt way better. I would say at least 80% of the side content in this game should have been cut entirely and replaced with content that puts focus on the main cast surrounding Clive. The story has plenty of powerful moments and themes worth exploring, but too many of these moments are left inadequately explained from a narrative standpoint. Some of the best side stories are locked behind exorbitantly tedious side quest design, and the themes are presented with a lack of nuance that does not befit what is supposed to be a dark fantasy. Final Fantasy is a franchise that is not supposed to be afraid of reinventing itself. But that was the overall impression I ended up getting from Final Fantasy XVI. Everything is too safe or too superficial. They created the mechanics for an action game and placed them into the game world of a more traditional JRPG. But because it's fundamentally an action game, that JRPG world is way too undercooked. And because it all takes place in a JRPG world, that action game doesn't get the proper locale to flex its muscles. If they wanted to actually take a risk on a mainline Final Fantasy game, they should have just made this a linear action game with a hardcore focus on replayability over everything else. This game is way too bloated for its own good. Can I recommend Final Fantasy XVI? Yes. I think for as many shortcomings this game has, the majority of people who play it are not going to be nearly as annoyed by it or pedantic about it as I am. I understand that I am very much in the minority when it comes to scrutinizing a game this hard. For people who want a fun action romp that has some of the most breathtaking and mind-blowing moments in a AAA game with a solid cast of characters and a fantastic soundtrack to back it all up, Final Fantasy XVI will undoubtedly deliver. However, if you are a longtime fan of the series who is more inclined to be critical and perhaps expect more from a mainline FF game, I can very much understand why you would be disappointed. I know that I certainly was. For as many things as this game does right, it also takes several unfortunate steps backward. Wow, that'll do it. Thank you so much for watching. If you sat through all this, this is going to be a new type of format that I'm going to be trying on my channel. Sort of a more, laid back, talking from the couch. Excuse me. Talking from the couch with music playing over and some images appearing on screen and that kind of thing. I just don't have the energy or the inclination to do these super hardcore edited videos anymore. I work a full-time job and I have a fucking mortgage to pay, so I don't need to work 2 jobs. So this is something I think I'm just going to start doing, because for me it's just more important to get my thoughts out there in a semi-structured format than to do all the bells and whistles that comes with editing and so on. So if you watch this, I want to give you my sincere, heartfelt thanks, and look forward to more, because I've got 2 more videos coming down the pipeline. One is on, they're all going to be Final Fantasy related. I'm in a Final Fantasy mood. So one is going to be about Final Fantasy VIII, a reevaluation, and one is going to be about Final Fantasy VII Remake. So if you enjoyed this, please look forward to that, and I'll see you next time.